At exactly 4:14 a.m., at the port of Novorossiysk, a Russian sailor stands on the cold steel deck of an improved Kilo-class submarine, lighting a cigarette and watching the harbor lights ripple across the water, unaware that death is already drifting within a few feet of his hull. Because beneath the calm surface, this night is not a coincidence but the final movement of a plan written months earlier. A plan built on the understanding that the most dangerous part of a naval strike is not sinking the ship, but blinding the eyes that protect it. And that as long as Russia's airborne anti-submarine surveillance remains intact, every underwater drone is little more than expensive debris waiting to be discovered and destroyed. What makes this moment lethal is not surprise alone, but timing, because the submarine itself is not the primary target yet. Even though it represents a $470 million investment and one of the Black Sea Fleet's most capable assets, since the real obstacle sits on a nearby airfield in the form of an IL-38N Sea Dragon, an aircraft designed to hunt submarines before they ever see danger coming, equipped with the sensors that can turn the quiet Black Sea into a transparent map of acoustic signatures. And as long as that aircraft can fly, any maritime assault is mathematically doomed before it begins. That understanding drives the entire operation backward in time to 11 p.m. at a secluded airstrip deep inside Ukraine, where the night air is thick and cold, and a single long-range Beaver drone is rolled into position under minimal lighting, not as a show of force, but as a precision instrument. Because this drone is not meant to survive, it is meant to deliver a single, irreversible effect. Launched into darkness with no radio chatter, no video feed, and no external control signals that could betray its existence to Russian electronic warfare systems scanning the sky. As the Beaver accelerates down the rough asphalt and lifts free of the ground, its onboard flight computer immediately forces it into a steep descent, leveling out at roughly 150 feet above the terrain, a regime known as nap of the earth flying, where the drone uses the curvature of the land, tree lines, and terrain clutter to physically hide from long-range radar, and at this altitude, it disappears beneath the coverage of S-400 search systems positioned in Crimea, not through stealth coatings or electronic trickery, but through geometry and patience. Inside the drone there is silence, because its communication modules are intentionally dormant, with no satellite link, no live control, and no telemetry transmission, guided instead by a hardened anti-jamming navigation system paired with a laser ring gyroscope that tracks every movement with ruthless accuracy, correcting for wind drift and micro deviations thousands of times per second, allowing it to fly an invisible corridor through overlapping air defense zones that assume nothing that quiet and that low could possibly be a threat. For nearly 3 hours, the Beaver cuts through freezing darkness, passing unseen across monitored regions, while Russian air defense crews remain locked in their routines, watching empty scopes and fighting fatigue, unaware that the most dangerous aircraft of the night does not announce itself. And by the time the drone approaches the outer perimeter of Yeisk Air Base, it has already won most of the battle, because no alarms sound and no radios crackle with urgency, leaving the base asleep while the trap quietly closes. At 1:47 a.m., the plan almost failed, not because of human error, but because of infrastructure. When the Beaver is forced to climb slightly to clear a line of power cables near the runway threshold, gaining just enough altitude to expose a vulnerability that normally does not exist, as the spinning wooden propeller generates a faint micro-Doppler signature, a unique radar artifact that modern air defense software has been trained to recognize when targets appear at extremely close range. On the edge of the airfield, a Panzer S-1 air defense vehicle catches that flicker, and the system reacts faster than any human ever could, slewing its turret and transitioning from passive monitoring to active engagement in less than a second. While inside the command vehicle, the radar display erupts from calm green into flashing red, and the illusion of safety at the base collapses instantly as air raid sirens begin tearing through the night. The alert propagates across secure networks within moments, reaching Novorossiysk harbor, where command phones ring and sleepy garrisons snap awake. Searchlights slicing across the water, while patrol boats roar to life and sonar operators flood the bay with active pings. Because to Russian commanders, this looks like a clumsy Ukrainian attempt to force a reaction, something loud, obvious, and already defeated, since the drone has been detected and destruction appears inevitable. What they do not see is that detection is not failure, but confirmation, because the Beaver does not dive, does not attempt to strike buildings, and does not flee, instead maintaining its altitude with deliberate precision as it passes directly above the parked IL-38N Sea Dragon, positioning itself not as a missile, but as a delivery platform, waiting for a single coded command that transforms it from an aircraft into a weapon aimed straight down at the most fragile part of the plane beneath it. When that command arrives, the Beaver's warhead detonates not outward but downward in a controlled directional burst, splitting its casing and releasing roughly 2,000 pre-formed tungsten cubes in a dense cone that falls with brutal efficiency, shredding the Sea Dragon's fiberglass radome, destroying its anti-submarine sensor suite, severing hydraulic lines, rupturing fuel tanks, and turning delicate avionics into useless debris, all in the fraction of a second before the Panzer missile intercepts and obliterates the drone itself. The missile strike looks like a defensive success on Russian screens, a clean kill against an intruder, but it arrives too late to matter, because the damage has already been done, and within seconds the aircraft is rendered irreparable, legally dead without being spectacularly destroyed, leaving the Black Sea Fleet blind in the air, just as the clock continues ticking toward the real target still waiting silently in the harbor, untouched and unaware of what losing its guardian truly means. The destruction of the IL-38N triggers consequences faster than the debris can settle, because within minutes, Russian command realizes that what they believed was a failed drone strike has removed their most critical layer of maritime awareness. And at approximately 2:15 a.m., the harbor commander at Novorossiysk abandons caution entirely and orders a scorched earth defense posture, sealing the port not with finesse, but with panic, as tugboats begin dragging rusted barges into the main channel and scuttling them in place to form a crude steel barricade designed to stop anything else from slipping inside. At the same time, the underwater environment changes violently as every shore-based sonar array is cranked to maximum active power, transforming the harbor from a quiet acoustic space into a screaming wall of noise, where high-frequency pings bounce off rocks, pilings, fish, and hulls until meaningful echoes dissolve into chaos, while patrol boats carve aggressive patterns across the surface, throwing stun grenades into the water, and sailors line the piers with thermal optics and man-portable air defense systems, scanning for threats that now feel omnipresent but remain unseen. To Russian commanders, this overwhelming response feels decisive, because any underwater drone attempting to enter this environment would be instantly detected by cavitation noise or electric motor signatures, and for a brief moment they believe the crisis has been contained, unaware that the very intensity of their defenses has created a new vulnerability, one that only becomes visible to Ukrainian operators watching the telemetry screens in Kiev as acoustic interference spikes off the charts. Inside the command bunker, the mood shifts from confidence to calculation, because the submerged Sea Baby and Toloka drones approaching the harbor edge are now facing sonar density so extreme that even minimal propulsion would expose them instantly, and the mission commander is forced to confront the possibility that months of preparation, millions of dollars in development, and the successful blinding of Russian surveillance may still end in failure if the drones attempt to force their way through a sensory kill zone designed to catch anything that moves. At approximately 2:35 a.m., the Russian defenses settle into a steady rhythm, actively hunting for high-speed propellers and motor noise, confident that silence means absence. And it is precisely at this moment that the Ukrainian operators make their most counterintuitive decision, choosing not to fight the sensors, but to disappear from them entirely, as commands are issued that shut down propulsion systems and place guidance electronics into sleep mode. The effect is immediate and profound. because to any electronic system, the drones now effectively cease to exist. Their motors scent, their emissions gone, leaving them as inert objects in the water. No longer vehicles, but masses obeying only buoyancy and current. And in this state, physics becomes the pilot, carrying them forward on the natural tidal flow of the Black Sea, moving steadily into the harbor at roughly 2 knots. This choice transforms Russian defenses from protection into camouflage, because the active sonar flooding the harbor creates a constant background roar that masks the slow drift of objects moving at the same speed as the surrounding water, causing operators to filter out these contacts as debris or biological clutter, while patrol boats race past, unaware that the threat is no longer chasing targets, but simply floating with the environment they are desperately trying to control. As the drones approach the steel boom nets guarding the harbor entrance, another assumption collapses, because these barriers are designed to stop surface threats and fast-moving torpedoes, not objects creeping inches above the seabed. And near the muddy bottom, a gap exists to allow tidal flow, a gap that the drones exploit by maintaining neutral buoyancy and slipping beneath the heavy mesh like smoke under a door. Inside the harbor, the water grows calmer and darker, dominated by the looming silhouette of the improved Kilo-class submarine moored at the pier, its massive hull blocking what little ambient light remains. A machine built to hunt unseen, now itself blind and exposed. While inside the Kyiv bunker, the room goes quiet as telemetry shows the distance to target closing with agonizing slowness. 100 feet becomes 80, then 50, as low-light cameras reveal the submarine's 7-bladed propeller in stark detail, motionless and immense. Critical vulnerability presented without resistance, and the operator's hand hovers over the trigger, while 2 options crystallize in his mind, each carrying consequences that will ripple far beyond the harbor walls. The first option promises certainty. A strike against the stern that would destroy the propeller, rudder, and shaft seals, flooding compartments and leaving the vessel crippled but structurally intact, while the second option carries greater risk and greater potential reward. Aiming amidships near forward missile tubes loaded with cruise missiles, where a secondary explosion could annihilate the pier itself, but might also fail to propagate, leaving only partial damage. The decision hangs unresolved in that moment, not because of indecision, but because the plan does not require haste. As the drones continue drifting closer, under cover of Russian panic, and with every passing second, the balance of power shifts further away from the defenders who believe they are still in control of a harbor, already compromised at the most fundamental level. At 9 o'clock a.m. the following morning, after hours of silence that feel heavier than combat, the security service of Ukraine mission commander in Kyiv leans forward and issues the final instruction, not shouted or dramatized, but delivered in a calm, controlled tone that reflects how thoroughly the outcome has already been accepted. Because at this point, the decision is no longer about whether the strike will succeed, but about how much irreversible damage will be inflicted in the seconds that follow. Deep beneath the surface of Novorossiysk harbor, 2 underwater drones receive the command simultaneously, their onboard logic boards processing the signal in milliseconds before briefly reactivating their electric motors, not to maneuver or evade, but to press their warheads firmly against the steel skin of the submarine's stern, ensuring maximum contact and eliminating any chance that explosive energy will dissipate harmlessly into open water. When the detonation occurs, it does not resemble a cinematic fireball, because underwater explosions obey different rules, and the 1,000-pound high-grade explosive charges transform instantly into superheated gas, all that the surrounding water cannot compress or escape, forcing the full violence of the blast upward as if against a solid anvil, directing the energy exactly where Ukrainian engineers intended it to go. On the surface, the effect is shocking even to observers accustomed to destruction, as the pier itself jumps several feet into the air and a massive geyser of mud, debris, and white foam erupts skyward, dwarfing nearby cranes and infrastructure, while a deep concussive crack follows moments later, shattering windows miles away and announcing to the city that something far more serious than an accident has just occurred. Yet the most critical damage unfolds invisibly in the milliseconds after the flash, because these warheads are not simple contact explosives, but employ programmable millisecond delay fuses, allowing the initial impact to force the charges tightly against the hull before detonation, creating a water hammer effect that drives a focused pressure wave through the submarine's outer light hull and into the inner pressure hull beneath. Trapped within the cylindrical steel structure, the shockwave ricochets off internal bulkheads, amplifying itself with each reflection and turning the submarine's own architecture into a weapon against it, snapping the massive rudder as if it were brittle wood and twisting the propeller shaft violently out of alignment, shredding watertight seals designed to withstand far less catastrophic forces. The stern does not merely begin to leak. It disintegrates, allowing the Black Sea to rush into the engineering compartments at pressures strong enough to tear through machinery and flesh alike, flooding systems faster than any damage control response could hope to contain. While inside the vessel, alarms scream and lights flicker before dying altogether in the corrosive mix of salt water and battery acid. Above, chaos erupts along the pier as Russian sailors, many deafened by the blast, stumble through smoke and confusion, officers shouting orders that cannot change the outcome, while damage control teams rush forward with pumps and hoses that might as well be ceremonial because buoyancy has already been mathematically defeated and the laws governing the submarine's survival no longer apply. The massive hull begins to groan with a sound described later as metal screaming, a low grinding noise that carries across the harbor as the stern drops rapidly toward the seabed, dragging the bow upward and forcing the vessel into a severe list that tilts it sharply to starboard, transforming a symbol of naval power into a helpless, dying structure pinned against its own moorings. Within minutes, the improved Kilo-class submarine, once considered one of the most survivable assets in the fleet, is dead in the water, its internal compartments flooded, propulsion destroyed, and command systems ruined, while any remaining hope of recovery fades with each passing second, as water continues pouring into spaces never meant to be exposed. Over the next 24 hours, the final confirmation arrives, not from military channels, but from commercial satellite imagery, which shows the submarine resting on the harbor bottom with its conning tower barely breaking the surface at an unnatural angle, an image that strips away any remaining ambiguity and transforms speculation into undeniable fact visible to anyone with access to modern sensors. But even this humiliation is not the end of the story, because in the immediate aftermath, Russian commanders compound their losses through panic, ordering additional barges to be sunk across the harbor entrance in a frantic attempt to prevent further attacks, unknowingly achieving what Ukrainian planners could not by physically trapping their own remaining ships inside the port. With the entrance sealed and confidence shattered, the Black Sea Fleet effectively ceases to function as an operational force. Patrols halted, logistics ships refusing to enter the harbor, and supply chains freezing solid for roughly 96 hours, as fear of unseen drones overrides doctrine and turns every ripple and shadow into a potential threat. By midday, the harbor feels less like a military installation and more like a crime scene frozen in shock as crews move cautiously around twisted steel and floating debris, every sound amplified by nerves stretched to the breaking point because the realization has finally set in that this was not an isolated strike, but a systemic failure, one where layers of defenses, doctrine, and expensive hardware were dismantled in sequence by systems that never announced themselves, never rushed, and never offered a clear target to retaliate against. Inside Russian command centers, the operational picture collapses rapidly, since without the IL-38N airborne sensor network, there is no reliable way to distinguish real underwater contacts from false ones, and every sonar return now carries the same weight, forcing commanders to assume the worst in every scenario slowing decision cycles and paralyzing initiative, as officers hesitate to move assets that might already be marked for destruction. This hesitation ripples outward immediately, because logistics vessels scheduled to resupply ammunition and fuel delay their departures. Captains unwilling to risk entering a harbor that has become synonymous with invisible threats, while escort units refuse to fan out into open water without aerial cover that no longer exists, turning what should be routine movements into prolonged debates that burn time Ukraine can exploit elsewhere. On the front lines, the effects become visible within hours, as artillery units dependent on naval supply chains begin rationing shells, commanders revising fire plans and postponing assaults that now lack guaranteed sustainment, while Ukrainian ground forces feel the pressure easing as Russian rear units divert attention inward, forced to defend their own bases instead of supporting offensive operations. The psychological damage deepens faster than the material losses, because crews who watched a submarine die at the pier and an aircraft be executed on the tarmac now view every quiet moment as suspicious, sleeping in short bursts, scanning sensors compulsively, and second-guessing routine procedures. As fear of the unseen replaces confidence in armor, steel, and decades of accumulated naval tradition. In planning rooms, the language shifts noticeably, from projections and timelines to contingencies and damage control, as officers begin framing operations around avoiding loss rather than achieving objectives. For Ukrainian planners, the operation validates a doctrine built around patience, integration, and restraint, where success is not measured by explosions alone, by cascading effects that lock an opponent into self-defeating responses, forcing them to spend more resources defending against ghosts than advancing against real threats. What makes the sequence so devastating is its efficiency, since within a single 24-hour window, a surveillance aircraft and a capital naval asset are neutralized without massed firepower, without air superiority, and without exposing Ukrainian personnel to direct retaliation. International observers studying satellite imagery and intercepted communications note the pattern emerging beneath the surface events, recognizing that the true weapon deployed was not a drone or a warhead, but uncertainty, injected deliberately into every layer of command, until even overwhelming force could not be applied with confidence. For the Black Sea Fleet, the outcome is unmistakable, as it transitions from an active instrument of power into a constrained presence confined by its own defensive measures, its remaining ships effectively prisoners of a harbor transformed into a maze of fear and overreaction. By the time normal operations tentatively resume, the strategic landscape has already shifted, because the lesson has been learned on both sides that control of the battle space no longer belongs solely to those with the biggest platforms, but to those who can shape perception, timing, and response with surgical precision. The night that began with a sailor lighting a cigarette ends as a case study in modern warfare, where silence proved louder than fire, patience outperformed speed, and fear itself became the most enduring payload delivered beneath the dark water of Novorossiysk harbor. At 0617 local time, the Dnipro River looked like a sheet of black glass, broken only by reed shadows and the faint shimmer of current. And that is exactly why the Ukrainian Barracuda drone boat chose this hour to move. It slipped off the Ukrainian bank near Croissant with no running lights, no engine roar, and no human silhouette on deck. Just a low fiberglass profile and a heat signature that, from the wrong angle, could look exactly like the kind of hostile craft Ukrainian sentries are trained to stop without hesitation. The operator did not have the luxury of a dramatic run-up or a second attempt, because the first few hundred meters of any river mission are often the deadliest, not because of Russian defenses, but because friendly forces along the corridor must decide in seconds whether a fast-moving object is a threat or a friendly asset that cannot be allowed to be lost before it ever reaches enemy water. The Barracuda cleared the last reeds on the Ukrainian side and entered open water, and within moments, a Ukrainian machine gun team positioned roughly 500 feet upriver began to track the bright streak in their night optics. The gun barrel swung, the gunner's posture stiffened, and the operator in a hardened bunker roughly 14 miles away, felt his hands lock, as if the controls had turned to stone, because any sudden rudder input could make the boat look evasive. And evasive is what gets shot. Overhead, a Ukrainian first-person view quadcopter held a wide orbit and broadcast a coded friendly signal, but the river was too saturated with noise and too full of deception for a radio cue alone to be trusted. So the gunner lowered his night vision goggles, searched for the one detail that mattered, and let the seconds stretch into a dangerous pause where the entire mission hung on a single recognition. 5 seconds passed, then more, and the gunner finally saw it. A pulsing infrared strobe on the Barracuda's hull, blinking in a pattern meant to be invisible to the naked eye, yet unmistakable through night vision. And the weapon did not fire. The tension in that moment is not cinematic, it is procedural, because it depends on a pre-watch turnover corridor briefing that tells every outpost which lane a friendly drone will transit, what time window to expect it, and what identification signal to confirm before pulling a trigger. The gunner did what the briefing demanded, held fire, and the Barracuda drifted forward on momentum alone, passing through the friendly danger zone, not by luck, but by aligning corridor, code, and behavior so the humans guarding the river could keep radio silence and still make the right call. That near engagement is common because the Barracuda is designed to resemble what it must survive: small, fast, low, and hard to classify in the dark. Its hull is 18 feet of fiberglass composite, light enough to plane at high speed, yet tough enough to absorb small arms impacts without immediate catastrophic failure, riding just 16 inches above the waterline on a modified deep V shape that cuts through river chop while keeping radar cross-section minimal. Propulsion is a single 20-watt brushless electric motor fed by lithium batteries, giving roughly 4 hours of endurance at patrol speed. And at 8 knots, the motor is nearly sent until the boat is within roughly 200 feet. When the throttle is opened fully, that same drive pushes the craft to 38 knots, a sprint fast enough to outrun manned vessels the Russians keep on this stretch of the Dnipro, and fast enough to compress a defender's reaction time into a few helpless seconds. The payload explains why the mission cannot afford friendly fire. In the bow sits a shaped charge warhead, weighing 35 kilograms, sized to gut a patrol boat or detonate a fuel depot, and the guidance logic assumes the strike must still happen even if the link fails. If the control connection collapses completely, an onboard global positioning system autopilot can execute a final waypoint attack autonomously, turning the craft from a remotely steered platform into a weapon that can finish a run on its own. That is why Ukrainian nighttime river identification doctrine relies on 3 confirmations rather than 1. Because a soldier scanning the river sees only a bright, low streak and has perhaps 3 seconds to decide whether to shoot. And the cost of guessing wrong is either letting a Russian boat through or destroying a Ukrainian mission before it begins. So the Barracuda crawled through the friendly corridor at 8 knots, not because speed was unavailable, but because behavior is a deliberate identification marker. At low speed, the wake stays flat and controlled, a thin ripple that looks planned rather than evasive, while hostile sabotage boats tend to sprint and zigzag because they are trying to avoid fire. The 3 checks remain the same every night: the right corridor, the correct infrared strobe code, and a straight, predictable track that matches the briefing. Once the Barracuda cleared the final checkpoint and entered the transition channel beyond the last Ukrainian positions, the operator finally allowed the throttle to rise, because the next threat could not be reasoned with, could not be briefed away, and would not care that the craft was friendly. In the mid-river channel, the escort drone climbed to widen its view, and the operator's video feed began to stutter, freeze, and jump, as if the river itself were tearing holes in the signal. The interference was Ukrainian, not Russian, because every night Ukrainian electronic warfare units flood the corridor with radio noise, meant to disable hostile drones before they reach friendly lines, and the jamming does not politely discriminate. The Barracuda cannot be driven directly from the bunker at that distance because terrain and clutter break straight-line radio propagation, So Ukraine uses a relay chain, where commands travel by fiber optic cable to a concealed transmitter roughly 8 miles behind the front line. Then a narrow 4-degree radio beam reaches an overhead relay drone, a heavily modified DJI Matrix 300 carrying a 15-watt repeater. The latency spike was immediate and dangerous, jumping from roughly a tenth of a second to nearly half a second, a delay that turns steering into guesswork because the operator is no longer controlling where the boat is, only where it was moments ago. The Barracuda drifted several degrees off course as overlapping echoes confused the receiver, and the operator resisted the instinct to fight it aggressively, knowing that overcorrection at water level often makes things worse, not better. Instead, the FPV pilot overhead reacted first, climbing another 200 feet and sliding laterally to realign the relay path above the worst of the jamming, pulling the signal out of the noise long enough for the video feed to snap back into focus, and for the operator to make 2 short rudder taps that brought the craft back onto its planned track. That brief recovery did not mean safety, only progress, because the river ahead narrowed into a flooded forest where the geometry of the fight changed completely. Reed walls rose roughly 15 feet on both sides, blocking ambient light and turning the Barracuda's nose camera into a useless black smear, forcing the operator to abandon direct perspective and rely entirely on the overhead thermal feed. From above, the FPV's 640 by 512 sensor revealed a maze of submerged logs, sandbars, and debris that looked identical at water level, but glowed differently in thermal contrast, because waterlogged wood holds heat longer than river silt, and that difference is the line between slipping through and tearing open a hull in the dark. Inside the flooded forest, speed became the enemy rather than protection, so the Barracuda slowed to roughly 6 knots, just enough to maintain steerage without committing to impacts it could not see. At higher speeds, a submerged log would snap the propeller shaft or flip the boat, while a sandbar would bury the hull in mud and end the mission instantly. The FPV pilot called corrections in clipped, single-word bursts: left, steady, right, steady, while the operator nudged the rudder a fraction at a time, watching the white silhouette thread through narrow gaps like a hand guiding a blade through tall grass where one wrong move ends the cut. A faint shape slid past the Barracuda's port side on thermal, resolving into a half-submerged, rusted barge hull, invisible from the surface. And if the boat had held its original heading, it would have scraped the wreck hard enough to compromise the fiberglass. The channel narrowed further, until the passage was barely 10 feet wide, reeds brushing both sides of the wake, and for roughly 200 feet, the operator held his breath while the FPV maintained a vertical view that turned chaos into geometry. When the reeds finally opened, the Barracuda emerged into a wider channel with real current, deeper water, and space to maneuver. But that openness carried its own danger because concealment had just disappeared. Outside the flooded forest, the channel stretched roughly 300 feet wide. Low vegetation lined the banks, and the Barracuda's thermal bloom was now visible from half a mile in any direction. Inside the reeds, 15-foot walls blocked line of sight from Russian observation drones, but out here, the boat glowed clearly against the cooler water. The FPV pilot spotted the first faint white speck on the thermal display 2,000 feet to the northeast, then another circling above the Russian bank, and neither belonged to Ukraine. The hunt had begun, and the timeline compressed from minutes to seconds. The first Russian FPV transitioned from a lazy orbit into a dive, dropping from roughly 600 feet and accelerating toward the Barracuda at an attack speed approaching 70 miles per hour, leaving the operator perhaps 8 seconds to react. The order was immediate and simple: reduce throttle and drift into the reeds, because speed attracts attention and motion draws fire. Power cut. The Barracuda slid on momentum into dense vegetation, the motor cooling rapidly as the hull disappeared beneath overhanging stalks. And on thermal, it became just another warm shape among dozens of mud banks and debris piles that littered the river edge. The Russian drone screamed overhead at low altitude, its camera hunting for a target that no longer looked distinct, circling once, then again, before climbing back toward patrol height without committing to a strike. Without a clear lock, the pilot would not waste his drone, but the reprieve was temporary because a second Russian FPV was already repositioning with a better idea of where to look. The operator did not wait for that moment to arrive, keying his radio and passing a grid reference with bearing data to request immediate suppression, knowing that this was the exact scenario the next layer of the system exists to handle. Roughly 14 miles behind the front line, a Buovel air defense electronic warfare vehicle was already tracking the Russian drone activity, a modified tactical truck carrying multiple phased array antenna panels mounted on a rotating turret. Unlike older jammers that flood entire spectrums with noise and blind friendly systems as easily as enemy ones, Buovel uses digital radio frequency analysis to identify hostile signal characteristics and generate targeted interference across a range spanning roughly 400 MHz to 6 GHz, wide enough to cover the control links Russian FPV drones rely on, while sparing Ukrainian relay paths that operate on different bands. When the turret rotated and the panels aligned on the threat sector, the system focused its energy into a narrow cone rather than spraying it blindly, and the effect was immediate on the thermal feed. The first Russian drone wobbled as its control inputs lagged, then nosed over and dropped into the river within seconds, while the second tried to climb out of the jamming zone, only to be tracked and suppressed until it spiraled down and crashed into the reeds several hundred feet from the Barracuda's hiding position. The operator counted 10 seconds of silence on the thermal display before easing the throttle back up, because hesitation now would only invite a different kind of danger. With the immediate threat neutralized, the Barracuda slid out of concealment and resumed its course toward the target, and the river ahead opened into a final approach that offered no cover at all. Across several hundred feet of open water sat the objective, a cluster of Russian outboard boats tied near a makeshift dock, fuel drums stacked on wooden pallets, and temporary supply shelters glowing white-hot in thermal contrast. This was the small boat logistics hub that supported raiding operations for months, and the moment the Barracuda entered open water, the Russians responded not with gunfire, but with something designed to break the mission at its weakest point. As the craft accelerated, the video feed tore apart into blocky pixels and frozen frames, latency spiking again as throttle commands stacked without executing, and the operator immediately recognized the signature of hostile electronic warfare. On the left bank, a vehicle-mounted Sealock 01 system had come alive, flooding the corridor with interference meant to blind Ukrainian FPV drones and artillery spotters. And at water level, that noise hit surface vessels even harder. The FPV relay overhead still received the bunker uplink clearly thanks to altitude, but the final link down to the Barracuda was collapsing, severing the chain at the worst possible moment just as the target loomed ahead. For several seconds, the operator was effectively blind. With no reliable nose camera, no trustworthy telemetry, and no certainty that his inputs were reaching the boat at all because the Barracuda's antenna sat only 10 inches above the waterline, where reflected signals, reeds, and Russian noise combined into an electronic wall. The FPV pilot did not wait for orders. Climbing rapidly from low altitude to well above 1,500 feet and shifting laterally to hunt for a gap in the jamming pattern, exploiting the fact that ground-based jammers project interference horizontally and often leave vertical blind spots directly above or at steep angles from the source. Every second that passed without control increased the risk of drifting into reeds or running aground within sight of the target. During those seconds, the operator switched entirely to the overhead thermal feed and began steering by silhouette alone, watching the bright outline of the Barracuda slide across the dark water and making rudder inputs based on where it appeared rather than where it should have been. Each adjustment was a calculated gamble because latency meant every command arrived late, and overcorrecting could send the boat straight into a bank. The FPV continued climbing and shifting eastward, aligning its antenna geometry until the relay path punched through the interference. And when the feed snapped back into sharp focus and latency dropped to a manageable fraction of a second, the operator corrected the heading with 3 quick pulses, knowing the jamming zone was finally behind them. The target was now roughly 700 feet ahead, with nothing but open water in between. The operator pushed the throttle to maximum, and the electric motor surged, lifting the hull onto plane as the Barracuda leapt forward at 38 knots. Faster than any Russian soldier on the bank could process what they were seeing. On thermal, the wake flared bright white as the bow cut cleanly through the water, and the FPV pilot tightened his orbit to capture every second of the run because there would be no second pass. The Russians did react, but reaction does not equal prevention when time collapses this quickly. Figures scattered along the riverbank, some diving for cover, while others reached for rifles that were never meant to stop a fast-moving surface drone, closing the distance at nearly 20 meters per second. At that speed, the Barracuda covered 100 feet in less than 2 seconds, and by the time the first weapon came up, it was already inside 400 feet, then 200, compressing the defender's decision space to nothing. The operator locked the rudder toward the center of the clustered boats and fuel stacks, committing fully because hesitation at this point only reduces accuracy. The FPV pilot called distances in a steady cadence that matched the closing speed: 300 feet, 200, 100, and the nose camera washed out from glare as the reflective surfaces of fuel drums and hulls filled the frame. At roughly 40 feet, the operator released the controls, because guidance was no longer necessary, and the final outcome would be dictated by physics alone. The Barracuda's shaped charge was designed to rupture thin-walled targets and convert structural integrity into pressure, and on impact, the detonation directed its energy outward and downward in a single violent moment that erased the craft itself from the equation. The first Russian outboard boat flipped completely out of the water as the blast wave struck, its hull shattering before it crashed back down in pieces, and a stack of fuel drums ruptured almost instantly, igniting a fraction of a second later into a pillar of fire that rose roughly 60 feet into the night. The expanding pressure wave rolled across the staging area, collapsing 2 makeshift supply shelters and scattering ammunition crates into the reeds where secondary fires began to crawl. A second outboard boat tied to the dock disintegrated into fiberglass fragments and spinning engine parts, its remains thrown clear as if the mooring lines had never existed. Russian personnel fled inland without attempting organized response, abandoning equipment that was either already destroyed or about to be consumed by fire, because there was nothing left to defend. The logistics hub that had quietly supported small boat raiding operations for months ceased to exist in a single run, replaced by twisted metal, shattered wood, and burning fuel that would continue to smolder long after the Barracuda itself was gone. The FPV held its orbit until the thermal picture stabilized enough to confirm there were no remaining intact assets worth striking. From a distance, the destruction looked chaotic, but the sequence was anything but accidental. Every phase of the mission relied on layered identification, redundant control paths, adaptive electronic warfare, and disciplined restraint, where speed would have killed the mission early. The Barracuda survived friendly guns by behaving exactly as briefed, survived Ukrainian jamming through relay geometry, survived Russian drones through concealment and suppression, and survived hostile electronic warfare by exploiting altitude and angle rather than brute force. None of those elements mattered alone, but together they created a narrow corridor where success remained possible even when multiple systems failed at once. What the Russian side never publicly acknowledged is that this strike was not a technological gamble, but a procedural demonstration, showing how layered systems behave under stress when none of them work perfectly. No single component performed flawlessly, and yet the mission succeeded because failure was anticipated at every stage, from friendly identification to control link collapse. And because operators were trained to treat disruption as a normal condition rather than an exception, this mindset is what turns relatively simple platforms into persistent threats, especially in river environments where terrain, vegetation, and electronic clutter punish rigid plans and reward adaptive execution. The electronic warfare duel along the route revealed another quiet reality of modern river combat, which is that jamming is now a constant environmental condition rather than a discrete event. Ukrainian systems accepted self-interference as the cost of denying clean corridors to enemy drones, while Russian systems accepted collateral disruption as the price of blinding Ukrainian control links. And both sides relied on operators to fight through the noise rather than waiting for ideal conditions that never arrived.